healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
All right, well, welcome back for another episode of Coffee with Coker. My name's Mark Reiboldt. I'm the host, and this episode we have a little something different, and we've done this before. We do it from time to time. We'll often do it kind of towards the end of the year, kind of circling back on some things, if you will. So it is a kind of a Q&A episode, and it's also, I kind of call it more almost like a frequently asked questions, FAQ episode, where we get a chance to cover a hodgepodge of things real quickly. And most of these things will kind of bounce around, but we think they're relevant because we do commonly get questions about them, or we got maybe specific questions about them come up, and we can plug in other forms of our content to cover these things in more depth. So I'll cover a couple of topics here that we have really quickly. I'm just going to cover myself, so I apologize. There's no guests today. You guys will just have to listen to me, but I'll try to keep these fairly quick. And again, these are going to be pretty high level today, but we'll have reference material to dig in deeper, or maybe tease some stuff that's coming up here in the future that you can look out for deeper content. So let's jump right in, I guess. One of the things that I've heard a number of times come up from either clients or folks that we're talking to about possibly engaging us for assistance is in the realm of transactions and specifically valuation. So I want to cover a couple of quick things, again, pretty high level here. And before I do that, I want to refer everyone back to an episode that we talked specifically about the valuation process, the different types of valuations. And we had Yong Zhang and David Wallin, who run Coker's valuation practice, participate in that episode. And it was extremely good information. So I want to refer everybody back to that episode. We'll make sure there's a link for it and then notes to this episode, so you can go right there and listen to that. We got into a lot of depth in that, but there were a couple other things that I wanted to follow up on that tied into some of these questions. So one of the questions related to valuations that I've gotten, and this has come from a number of the healthcare attorneys that we work with, and the question is related to the valuation methodology of basically what we call an enterprise value. And Yong and David in that episode talked about the different terms and forms and methodologies of valuation. And enterprise value is like an equity value. It is more akin to the value of stock. It is goodwill value, as opposed to the opposite of that would be asset value. And asset value is performed through tangible asset valuation, where you go and literally value the in-place value on furniture, fixtures, equipment, etc., the tangible assets. Enterprise value is more of the value of the enterprise. And again, it incorporates a lot of goodwill. There are different methodologies for that. Won't get into that because, again, Yong and David talked about that in good depth. But the question I've gotten from some attorneys is it okay to use enterprise value methodology or use the value of the enterprise, which incorporates goodwill, in an asset purchase agreement? So say you're doing a transaction and it's going to be either an asset purchase or a stock purchase. And the far majority of transaction structures in deals involving healthcare services entities, specifically hospitals, physician groups, and kind of everything in between, surgery centers, et cetera, is going to be an asset purchase. Can you use enterprise value in doing those deals, or do you have to use a stock purchase if you use enterprise value? The answer is yes, you can use enterprise value in an asset purchase deal. The structure of the deal and the method of valuation, those are not entirely mutually exclusive. But for the most part, they are two separate things. I mean, they are two separate things, but for the most part, they are very distinct and almost unrelated. And this gets into a lot of nuance. Again, I'm going to cover this at a very high level. I just wanted to cover this one question, but there's nothing wrong with using an enterprise value such as, and a methodology such as the discounted cash flow under the income approach, and still having an asset purchase agreement as far as the structure of the deal itself. And so you can still get the benefit of an asset purchase, but the seller can get the benefit of the enterprise value. And I think this is something that can be confusing, and sometimes it can kind of hold up deals because there's some concern here. But the reality is, this is something that I think can really make these transactions much cleaner, because it's going to be much more preferable for the buyer to do an asset purchase, and then the seller is going to probably benefit more so, certainly 9 times out of 10, from looking at the value of the whole enterprise. Nothing wrong with doing this. And there's, again, more nuance to this, as you can imagine. If this is something where you all would like us to dig into and talk about deeper, would love to do that. And we could even bring one of our healthcare attorney friends on. We can talk about this in greater detail, but short answer is yes, this is something you can do. Tied to the whole valuation discussion, another common question that we've been getting from talking to clients and different organizations out there is the process itself. Again, David and Young talked about this in that episode, but I just want to go through one thing about the process. There are 2 very broad categories as far as our approach to valuations. And one is a formal valuation, kind of capital F, capital V almost. And the other is just what we kind of refer to as informal. I commonly refer to this as valuation advisory. So in a formal valuation, this is something that your organization or the specific organization involved needs a document. It is typically going to be an actual opinion document. So is something that can be used in the transaction documentation, maybe even in regulatory filings, potentially even in any sort of legal processes that may come up at any given time that different parties may want to look at. So this is a very formal thing. It's a very formal process, very formal approach. There's a formal report issued, draft and final. It's very structured. And again, David and Young talked about that. The informal valuation, and again, a lot of times what I refer to this as valuation advisory, is an organization may need assistance in understanding what is our group worth? What is our surgery center worth? We don't need a formal opinion. We don't need you all to spend hours and hours, days and weeks, et cetera, to author some very formal report that no one's going to read. But what we do need to know is kind of some bottom line information. And it's not just a number though. It's not just the value of your entity is X. There's more to that. There's nuances, there's scenarios. Typically, there's some sensitivity analysis that comes into play because it's a little more strategic in nature, but it's something that is used as kind of a form of intelligence, if you will. It's often used for working with a physician group. It's often used as something to help them make a decision. Okay, what are our options here? Maybe we can go and do this type of deal with a hospital, or maybe we can go and do or explore our options with private equity investors. Maybe we can use this for expanding and merging with another group and growing larger, and there's certain value to that. It's used as a strategic decision-making tool. It's also a tool used in the actual negotiations as well, because if you as a seller have a good idea of what the value of your entity is, then if you're out there negotiating with potential buyers and they come in with different ideas or different expectations, you have something that says, no, we have this, and we have very distinct analysis from an outside third-party expert, and this is the documentation for that. It doesn't need to be formalized, but you have enough there that gives you significant advantage in a negotiating scenario. If you're a hospital on that, in that kind of scenario, it's also very helpful because if you're going in, let's say as the buyer, then you already have that due diligence performed, and you have some basis there to say, okay, we've done the analysis. Here's what a reasonable range for valuation would be. This is something that's going to have to be updated, and this isn't kind of the final version of anything. This certainly isn't the formal offer, so to speak, but this is what is out there. So let's don't kind of haggle back and forth. There's no reason to keep going high and low and try to meet in the middle. I think we have what our range is. Let's figure out now what makes sense for all the parties. And even before you get to that point, it's a decision-making tool, because if you're looking at something and you kind of do this initial due diligence through an informal valuation, then there's two things that could happen. You could look at it and say, all right, this confirmatory for us, we feel good about this. Let's go and kind of continue with this process. Or you may look at that and say, wow, this is just way more than we expected. I think that we'd be a little in over our head here. I don't think we can make that work for whatever reason. So you know what? Let's don't waste people's time and spend more money going through this process when it could, not ultimately pay off. It's also, the last thing I'll say about it, it's a tool because it starts due diligence. So you already got a leg up in the due diligence process. So it can be very dangerous, and I've seen this happen many times, and hospitals do this often when buying physician practices. They will go and kind of take surface level numbers and form conclusions that ultimately go into an offer. And there's disclaimers and caveats to that. They'll say, yeah, and obviously we got to do our due diligence and confirm all this stuff. But when you've only done a cursory level of analysis and you go and you do that, there's a very high likelihood that those numbers will change significantly. And that's not good for anybody, because if you have to go in and redo all those numbers, and particularly if you're going in and lowering them a significant degree, I don't think a seller would be that surprised if, maybe they had to come down a little bit or got to go up a little bit. But if you're having to go in there and just, you realize after not doing any due diligence and you made these promises, and then you go in and realize, wow, we did not realize this. This is going to cut things in half or something like that. Then that is not a fun conversation to have. Not only could that kill the deal, but that could really damage any sort of go forward relationship there between those parties. And no one wants that. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that, because we have gotten a lot of questions on that, and we like to educate clients as far as the options, and making sure what we're doing for them and with them is exactly what they need, and not any more or any less, I guess. So I think hopefully that covered a little bit there. Again, we'll refer you back to that other episode. We'll talk more about valuation in the future, because that is something we do a lot of, and doing a lot of transaction advisory. So if you have questions or you would like additional follow-on information there, feel free to reach out to us. Moving on real quick, another topic that we've been hearing or getting more and more questions about, more and more interest to hear, is this private equity topic. And there's a lot there. That can mean a lot of different things. So I wanted to put out a little bit of a teaser first and foremost. In 2020, we are going to be in the early months of 2020, we're going to have a whole series of content and information come out on different things related to private equity deals. We've already done at least a couple of podcasts and done a number of white papers and articles on this topic. We've talked about, again, we'll make sure these are linked in the show notes, but we've talked about the private equity-like model for hospitals to do transactions with physician groups. We've talked about MSOs, management services organizations, and private equity deals, and a couple of other things. And so we're going to continue talking about these deals going into 2020. We're going to be talking about compliance matters related to these deals. We're going to be talking about different valuation methodologies. We're going to be talking about integration, post-transaction integration. We're talking about strategy and understanding alternatives as it relates to private equity. And this is where one of the questions comes up is, what are our options? Is private equity a good option? And there are a lot of groups out there of all sizes, all specialties, and really all over the country that are considering private equity as a succession option. Really, there's such a wide range of these types of deals, the type of private equity buyers that are out there, the terms that are typically associated with these deals, the structures, et cetera. And so we're going to be talking about that again. But one of the things that I've talked about recently is, and again, we're going to go into more depth here, but I just want to kind of tee this up, is kind of the non-economic components to private equity deals and considering options. So I've worked with a number of clients that say, hey, yeah, we're interested in exploring potential alternatives with private equity. And they may even start having some discussions with potential buyers. And they'll get a term sheet or maybe an LOI, and it'll walk through, here's our valuation, here's what we want to pay you, here's the structure, here's how this will work, here's how this is going to be likely to affect you financially and your partners. And that's usually where the conversation starts with us, or oftentimes is, because then we start getting into, okay, well, what else? What else do we need to consider here? And it goes beyond the economics, because it's great. You can look at numbers on a paper and say, and they may be really good looking numbers too. Often they are. And they can be very compelling to let's say a physician in a group with his or her partners that, they're at a different stage where maybe they're looking at retirement. This is a great option to kind of cap the career, if you will, and go into retirement with a payday. Maybe younger physicians, and maybe a great option to finish paying off those loans, get the kids through private school, whatever it is. And so that those dollars, those numbers on paper can be very compelling. But then once we start talking about, okay, well, let's go beyond the numbers and start thinking, what else? How does this affect you, Mr. or Miss physician that is at the tail end of the career, but doing this deal and getting this money requires another 5 years, not only 5 years of continuing your practice, which may not be a bad gig, right? But continuing your practice at historical production levels. So it's not like you're kind of slowing down and easing into retirement. You're kind of working at 100%, at least for that period. And oh, by the way, you've spent the last 30, 35 years essentially working for yourself or working alongside your partners. Now you're working for a new boss. And who is that boss? What does that dynamic look like? What does your schedule look like? How do things change as far as working with your mid-levels, your nurse practitioners, your PAs, and even your other clinical staff, LPNs, nursing staff, et cetera? What does it look like in terms of hiring and possibly firing staff? And then all the other things. How does our office culture change? How do the operations change? Are we going to have to go on an entirely new EMR because this buyer just implemented, Athena or Allscript or Epic or whatever, and that's kind of one of the requirements that they have, so everybody could be on the same system? How does the daily life change? For that doctor who is a little earlier on in their career, you have a number of years left. So this is the rest of your career now. What happens when private equity firm number one decides in 5 years to sell to another private equity firm, or it goes public and now you're owned by a publicly traded company? What are the possibilities that are out there? Some may be very positive. I don't want to make it sound like it's doom and gloom and that it's all going to be negative. My only point here is understanding that there's more to this equation than the numbers anyone shows you on paper and any promises they may make on the front end. That's very important. You may not be able to answer every question and get everything perfectly set up and guaranteed that it's not going to change. But I think these are things that must be considered, and it would definitely be beneficial for any physician group exploring private equity to do I would say a rigorous exercise and evaluation and I mean that evaluation beyond the valuation, evaluation to understand, let's, really drill down into some of the dynamics here. And then for my friends in private equity that are out there looking and buying, these are things that have to be addressed as well on your end. You not only want to close deals, but you want to have good deals that grow and are accretive in nature and ultimately will be monetized, grown, and possibly, ideally, through some sort of liquidity event, you can maximize those returns. Well, if you want to maximize returns doing deals partnering with healthcare services entities, these are things that have to be addressed. And I would recommend addressing them as much as humanly possible on the front end so they don't become problems that then on the back end that you have to go and resolve and address in kind of a defensive position. So those are my comments on that. Again, this is something particularly getting beyond the economics of a deal, kind of getting into the strategy, the different alternatives and options that we're going to be talking about a good bit here in the early part of 2020. So we would definitely love for everyone to stay tuned there. All right, last topic I want to cover real quick. This is actually a question that came up, and I am going to cover it very quick, but I kind of liked it because we have talked about on a couple of podcasts and in other content that we've produced here, certainly in 2019, is the overall topic of telehealth or telemedicine and really, kind of some of the evolving technologies, even going as far as AI and how it's growing and becoming much more commonplace and will continue to do so in the healthcare realm. But the question was essentially I'll make it real simple. Is telehealth real? Is it really here and growing? Or is this kind of one of those things that is people are talking about, but let's face it, it isn't really happening? And I kind of like this question. Again, I thought it was actually a good question because I'm one of those guys that I commonly think about these things when there's a lot of buzzwords and, interesting trends, those types of things going on that people are talking about out there, either at conferences or the media is covering or we hear about in social media. I'm a little bit of maybe a skeptic, I guess, because I'm always like, yeah, that's interesting. Are people really going to do that though? Is that really happening? And so that's why I kind of like this. And I think it's valid because I think we have to, it's great to talk about all the cool, quote unquote, cool things we could do. But, are they meaningful? Are they real? Are they really the best way to do things? So as it relates to that type of question in telehealth, I'll say, yes, it absolutely is happening. And we've continued to see that, whether it's from new companies with new and emerging technologies, or if it's just companies finding innovative ways to use this type of technology or this type of concept, the concept of telehealth, telemedicine, in different ways. And we've talked about this in other episodes, where the regulatory guidelines are continuing to evolve to not only accept telehealth, but actually encourage it. And then, of course, the best way to do that, right, is to pay for it, which we've seen with coding changes in 2019 that I think will continue to expand, where we can bill for these services. We can bill for more services that are done in a kind of a remote telemedicine environment. And I think we are going to continue to see that happen more and more. And as to the question of whether or not this stuff is actually happening, I really do think it is. I think where the question comes from is a lot of times we expect these things to happen in this like overt kind of explosive way. Telehealth is here and overnight this light switch changes and everybody's doing it type thing. And it's the new norm. The reality, though, is, and again, this is why I think there may be some either just questions or possibly even skepticism on this, is the fact that it's really not happening that way. I think it's happening in a much more subtle way, a little bit more of a slower evolution. And let's face it, that is something I think that is the norm and not to be surprised about as it relates to things like this happening specifically in the healthcare industry. The industry is notoriously slow to adopt and innovate, and that's okay. But I think that's how we're seeing telehealth play out. I think it absolutely has grown. I think it's grown more in 2019 than ever. And I think that trend will continue. Richard Romero's one of our team members here at Coker in our Nashville office. He is really our flag bearer on this overall topic of telehealth. So we'll definitely talk about this as well in 2020 more, and we'll continue to obviously monitor it. But I think where this is happening is kind of on the ground in a number of different ways, and we're seeing this being utilized, telehealth, different modalities, if you will, of telehealth and telemedicine being implemented by all kind of demographics of the industry, physicians, physician practices, different, a wide range of specialties. I would say even all specialties, and hospitals as well. It's not, and I think we commonly hear about the stories in media about different innovative technologies, like different telehealth technologies being utilized by your top tier academic medicine health systems, your Mayos and Hopkins and MD Andersons of the world. This is probably a little more commonplace, but we're actually seeing a lot of telehealth being utilized by community health systems, rural health systems, community medical centers, acute care, tertiary care, whatever it may be, and all the way down through the outpatient setting, all the way down through the clinical setting with physician practices. So yes, it's absolutely happening. We're also seeing a lot of good progress as it relates to the validation of it, meaning we're seeing that it's helping. It's a good thing. It's not just something that people are doing to look cool, to have the new cool whiz bang device, solution, or idea. It is something that is creating value. It's helping as far as ease on the users, meaning making things easier. And I think it's actually, and maybe we don't have the data, at least I don't in front of me, data to show this yet. I think we will as time goes by, but I think it's having a positive benefit from a clinical standpoint, quality standpoint as well. I think it's something we all want and we're all willing to do and embrace. And it's one of those things that it is happening, and I think it's going to continue to. So anyway, I wanted to address that real quick. That may be something we can follow up on, or you all may have feedback on. I'd love to hear it. If you disagree with me, please tell me that and tell me why, and love to have that dialogue. And if you're seeing something as it relates to this happening out there that I may have missed or we're not seeing, then I'd love to hear that too, because I'm really interested in this, and this is something we're monitoring very closely and continuously, and we'll continue to do so. So hopefully that was helpful. That's all I'm going to cover here. And again, this is something that going through some of these topics and questions we're going to be talking more about. So please stay tuned. And if you do have follow-on questions or would like us to dig deeper, let us know, because we want to respond to things that are of interest to you all, and we'll be glad to do that in future episodes and other content. So thanks for listening, and we look forward to hearing feedback from you all and speaking with you on future episodes. Thanks for listening.